A seemingly perfect childhood. If you'd passed our house on Maple Avenue during the spring of 2000, you might have caught a glimpse of what looked like the textbook definition of the American dream. I was the bright-eyed youngest daughter, born Sara Williams, just a few months shy of my 6th birthday when Mom married Greg. Our home was a 2-story, baby blue suburban dream with a tangle of daffodils erupting every March, a porch swing ready for summer evenings, and a mailbox reliable for birthday cards from relatives scattered across the country. Out front, the lawn was always manicured, and the American flag flapped gently in the breeze. Everything meticulously kept, just the way Mom liked it. There's a photograph from that first summer. I'm grinning wide, missing a front tooth, sitting between Mom and Greg on the porch swing. Our knees touch. Our smiles reach all the way to our hearts, or so it seems. My cousin Amelia used to whisper to her friends at family barbecues. They could be in a magazine. For the longest time, I believed it too. Mom was an elementary school music teacher, universally adored by her students, and able to coax a song from any group of fidgety kindergartners. Greg, my new stepdad, was a respected finance manager, stoic, reserved, but always willing to explain compounding interest with a twinkle in his eye. Neighbors brought over pies on holidays and stopped to chat during dog walks. To everyone on Maple Avenue, the Williams family was a model of wholesomeness, and invitations to our Labor Day picnics were coveted. I remember Saturday mornings thick with the smell of cinnamon French toast, sunlight gilding the kitchen tiles. Mom's laughter would ripple through the house as "Here Comes the Sun" played on the radio. Greg would read the newspaper, then offer me the comics section. I'd curl up in the living room recliner, tracing the patterns on its old velvet, feeling cocooned and safe. There was a sense of routine, an unspoken promise of continuity, as if nothing could ever go wrong. My friends envied me for the brand new bicycle that Greg assembled on my 7th birthday, and the elaborate Halloween parties Mom would throw in the backyard, apple bobbing and flashlight tag. The whole neighborhood squealing under the leafy oaks. At school, my teachers always remarked on how polite I was, how happy. There wasn't a parent-teacher conference where Mom and Greg didn't beam proudly, side by side, recounting my latest spelling bee victory, or funny anecdotes from home. On Christmas mornings, I found carefully wrapped presents tagged, "With love, Mom and Greg." I was taught to say thank you, to write notes to my grandparents, to help clear the table after family dinners. We were always performing, in a way, making sure the surface shone, even if the undercurrent felt, sometimes only faintly, a bit off. Yet for years, I clung to the belief that our life was everything it appeared to be. It didn't matter that Greg's eyes were sometimes cold, that his hand lingered too long on my shoulder, or that Mom seemed to move through certain evenings as if weighed down by invisible stones. Back then, I convinced myself none of that threatened our perfect picture. Because above all, the world saw the Williamses as enviable, a family to lean toward, not away from. The truth in the shadows. Looking back, the cracks in our perfect life were always there. I just didn't have the words for them then. When I was 10, the mask Greg wore for the world would slip when no one else was around. He would lower his voice to a dangerous whisper, his smile losing all its warmth the second we were alone. Greg had a way of making me doubt my own senses. I'd begin to wonder if I had imagined the way his fingers dug into my arm, or the strange dread I felt whenever Mom left us in the same room. The really dark things didn't happen all at once. They crept in slowly, almost invisibly. The heavy silences after dinner, The way Greg controlled what shows I was allowed to watch or which friends I was allowed to see. Anytime I disagreed, however gently, he'd raise an eyebrow and make a little joke, but the message was always clear. He was in charge. When he was angry, his voice could turn ice cold. He only needed to use a few words to make me feel like I was the one doing something wrong. At first, Mom didn't see it. She was always working late or grading papers, her brow furrowed with worry about money, about me, about everything. When I tried to tell her once that I didn't like being alone with Greg, she just smiled and ruffled my hair. "He's trying his best, honey. Family takes work." There were nights I'd lie awake, listening to the noises downstairs, the clink of glass, the drag of Greg's feet on the kitchen tile. Sometimes I could hear him fighting with Mom in hushed voices. Other times, he'd climb the stairs, and I'd squeeze my eyes shut, pretending to sleep. I started to get stomach aches before school and stopped inviting friends over. The safe, sunny house began to feel like a stage set for a play that had begun to unravel. I became an expert at hiding things. The bruises from the time he grabbed my wrist, the tears I cried into my pillow, the notebooks where I tried to write out my fears. I managed my best smiles for the neighbors, the teachers, anyone who might look too closely. I became a shadow in my own life, haunted by secrets I didn't yet know how to name. People say children are resilient, that they bounce back. But that old house on Maple Avenue taught me a different lesson. Some wounds you carry for years before you can admit they're even real. And for a long time, I carried mine in silence, hoping one day someone would look past our perfect picture and see the truth waiting in the dark corners. The years lived in fear. The word fear doesn't quite capture it. It was more like being haunted by a cold draft, something that slipped under your skin and never let up, day or night. By the time I turned 11, I didn't recognize the carefree child in my mother's photo albums. I was a shadow inside our house, nowhere and everywhere, moving soundlessly like I might disappear entirely if I made a wrong move. At school, I invented new smiles. I mastered jokes, kept my grades up, and nodded at every compliment. I knew exactly when to laugh, when to bite my tongue, and how to keep the spark in my eyes, even though it felt like the real me had gone quiet somewhere deep inside. I'd read stories in the library about brave girls who stood up to monsters and wondered why my bravery seemed to have gone missing. After school was the hardest. Mark worked late some nights, but was always there when Mom had after-school meetings or was out with coworkers. Those were the hours I dreaded most. His footsteps on the stairs made my heart seize. Sometimes he'd sit at the edge of the couch during dinner and watch me too closely while pretending to listen to the nightly news. I'd keep my responses brief, always polite, praying he'd lose interest, that nothing would trigger his cold temper. When Mark was angry, the whole house felt it. His disappointment wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, a pressing silence that bent everything around it. Once, I dropped a glass in the kitchen and it shattered. He didn't yell. He just stared at me with that hollow look, told me to clean every shard, and then watched while I bent, shaking, over the tiles. "Accidents have consequences," he murmured. His words always hung in the air long after he left the room, as if they might cut you if you moved too quickly. By 12, I'd stopped bringing friends home. I quit the soccer team, telling everyone I was too busy with schoolwork. But really, I just didn't want witnesses to the way our home changed at sunset. I felt invisible when I needed to be, blending into the wallpaper, counting the hours until Mom came home, hoping she'd notice the sadness in my eyes. Sometimes I'd leave tiny clues: a broken bracelet, a forgotten jacket on the porch, scribbles in a diary I hid behind my bed. But nothing broke through the surface. My mother was stretched thin, exhausted from juggling late papers and a house that never quite felt like her own anymore. The nights dragged. On the worst evenings, I'd lie awake, tracing patterns in the glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to my ceiling, listening to Mark clink glasses in the kitchen or shuffle through the hallway. I trained myself not to make a sound, not even to breathe too loudly. When he'd open my door, just to check, I'd squeeze my eyes shut and count backward from 100, pretending I was anywhere else, at Grandma's, by the sea, in the summer sun. Sometimes I'd curl into the closet with a flashlight and a battered copy of Little Women, praying morning would rescue me. I became expert at hiding. Long sleeves in summer to hide finger-shaped bruises. Careful explanations for every scrape. Falling off the bike, tripping at recess. Nobody questioned me. I was too polite to be in trouble, so well-adjusted, the textbook teacher's pet. But inside, I carried shame, fear, and a gnawing guilt that I must be the problem. The secret controlled everything: my grades, my friendships, even the way I sat at the dinner table. Any sudden noise sent my stomach lurching. I memorized escape routes, from the kitchen to the mudroom, from my bedroom to the backyard fence. I rehearsed excuses should neighbors ask why I never smiled as wide anymore. Just tired, studying a lot. Never the truth. My journal became my only real friend. Its pages were filled with coded notes, cryptic enough that Mark couldn't decipher, but honest enough that I didn't feel entirely alone. I wrote about the old me, fearless, silly, happy. I wrote about the new me, brittle, quiet, always planning an exit. I promised myself, somewhere in the inky swirl of nighttime panic, that someday I'd escape. I watched Mom, day after day, but she seemed lost too, caught in her own battles, shoulders sagging, eyes glazed by shadows I didn't understand. Sometimes, I hated her for not seeing what Mark did, for acting like our family was still the fairy tale we all performed in public. Other times, I felt guilty for my anger. Maybe I was the broken one. Maybe I was imagining it all. That's the thing about fear. It rewrites your mind. It made me believe nothing would ever change, that I deserved every sharp word, every cold look. I lived years like that. I didn't speak out. I didn't run. I just waited and hoped, but mostly survived, one impossible day at a time. Determined to revisit the past. If you had asked me when I was 18, on the day I accepted my college offer to NYU, what my future looked like, I might have given you a careful, well-rehearsed answer. I wanted freedom, anonymity, perhaps even a way to disappear into the glittering rush of New York City. But the truth flickered in me, silent as a moth in a closed drawer. I couldn't escape my own history, no matter how far I ran, or how loudly the city swallowed my footsteps. At college, everything was overwhelming and astonishing at once. My first night in the dorm, I pressed my face against the window and let the horns and sirens comfort me, each sound a reminder that someone, somewhere, was awake. For the first time, I almost tasted freedom. But past trauma clings to you. It seeps out when you're alone in the shower, when you misplace your keys, when someone utters a name you'd tried so hard to forget. The nightmares didn't fade. I'd wake gasping, tangled in sheets, certain I'd seen Charles's shadow at my door. My new friends didn't ask too many questions. Maybe they sensed my boundaries, or maybe I simply hadn't found words for that part of me. I wrote poetry between classes, scribbling lines about locked doors and muffled cries, and left the papers in the bottom of my backpack, both terrified and hopeful that someone might find them. I watched as my classmates called their mothers with mundane updates, or laughed over family group texts. Family. That word still tasted like burnt toast in my mouth. My mom and I talked, sometimes, about her job, the weather, my tuition. We danced around anything real. I missed the version of her that had existed before Charles, the way her eyes used to find mine and silently promise safety. Sometimes I wondered if she missed her old self too, but she never spoke about the past. Neither did I. Deep down, resentment simmered between my ribs, mixing shame and blame and a raw, bone-deep empathy for a woman who, in surviving her own pain, couldn't see mine. There were nights I wept for both of us, for the girls and women we'd been forced to become. In those moments, I would open my old journal, clumsily packed and half ruined with age, and remember the bruises, the lies, and the silent bargains I struck just to make it through. It was during my junior year, as autumn bled into a slate-gray winter, that everything changed. I attended a campus talk about survivors of abuse. The first time I'd sat among others who, like me, had grown skilled at hiding things. Their stories were like stones thrown into a silent pond. The ripples reached me. I realized I wasn't as alone as I'd once thought. After that night, something inside me refused to stay silent. I started researching, collecting statistics, learning about statutes of limitations, and the difference between memory and evidence. I discovered, with a sick mix of relief and horror, that sometimes cases did go to trial. If survivors were brave, if there was documentation, if the law cared enough. That's when the guilt shifted to determination. I knew what Charles looked like behind closed doors, how he convinced everyone, including himself, that he was a good man. I could picture the way his face fell into blankness when confronted. I began to realize that exposing the truth wasn't just about me, or even my mother. It was about refusing to let him have power over one more silent, cowed child, real or metaphorical. Over the next several months, I started collecting everything I could remember, everything I could prove. I called my cousin M, who'd never fully believed the picture-perfect family story. She and I shared fragments, awkward conversations we'd both overheard, the moments after family reunions where I'd locked myself in the bathroom and sobbed. M remembered her own uneasiness, the little details that added up. Her witness wasn't evidence, but it was validation. I felt less invisible. Digging into the past was like handling broken glass. I reached out to old childhood friends, careful in my wording. Did they remember anything strange about my home? Any reason they'd stopped coming over? Most of them hesitated. But Abby, my best friend until 6th grade, emailed me back late one night. "I always worried about you," she admitted, "but I never knew what to do." There were teachers, too. Mrs. Rowley, my 5th grade art teacher, wrote back after my cautious inquiry, "You were always so quiet, but I knew you were carrying something." I requested school records, old attendance logs, every scrap of possible corroboration. Piecing together the truth was slow, painful work. The hardest part was reaching out to Mom. I rehearsed the phone call for weeks before I made it. My palms sweated, my stomach twisted with dread. When I finally dialed her number, I reminded myself, this is for us, for the truth, not for vengeance. I wanted her to see me, not as a broken daughter, but as a survivor. I needed her on my side, or at least not standing in the way. The conversation did not go as planned. She wept, first in denial, then in grief, her voice splintered by guilt. How could I not have known? How could I have let this happen? I tried to absolve her, to separate her mistakes from the choices Charles made. But everything tangled. We talked for hours. By the end, she agreed to support my decision, to testify if needed, to help me piece together calendars and photographs, to be strong for us both. After final exams, I found a lawyer specializing in family abuse cases. She treated me like a person, not like a statistic. We mapped a plan: document everything, prepare for setbacks, brace for the ugly things families say, to preserve their own comfort. It was grueling, reliving the past in slow, surgical detail. I had to recount memories I'd locked away. The sound of Charles's voice on late-night calls, the precise color of anger in his eyes, the way my body had learned to shrink, to vanish. Each truth I spoke aloud felt like peeling off a layer of skin. I feared retaliation. There were text messages from blocked numbers, rumors flitting through distant relatives, veiled threats embedded in the way Charles still sometimes reached out, pretending nothing was wrong. But the momentum carried me forward. I wasn't just doing this for me anymore. I wanted to ensure no one else would ever have to live beneath his shadow, or behind the suffocating silence that had ruled our family for so long. By my senior year, I was two people: the student preparing for graduation and the woman determined to reclaim her story. At times, the roles bled into each other. I'd be standing in a lecture hall and suddenly remember the chill of the old house, or I'd laugh over pizza with friends and then get lost in old pain. But through it all, I learned that telling the truth, however excruciating, was its own form of liberation. Choosing to revisit the past was the hardest thing I'd ever done. But for the first time, I knew I was not powerless. I had my voice, my evidence, and an unshakable resolve that the false shine of our family would, finally, be stripped away. This time, the story would be mine to tell. The pursuit of justice. I always imagined that justice was swift and blinding, like a gavel crashing down, or a flash of lightning on a dark night. But when I started my own journey to hold Charles accountable, I learned that justice is anything but simple. It's slow. It tests every bit of your resolve, especially when your opponent is not just a man, but a system built to look away from ugly family secrets. My first steps were tentative. After that call with Mom, I spent weeks feeling a little sick every morning, knowing what I had set in motion could never be undone. I would sit in bed late at night, staring at the stack of old journals, childhood photographs, and crumpled attendance notices, and try to convince myself that the truth mattered more than the peace we'd all pretended to have. Some days, I nearly convinced myself to drop it, to let sleeping monsters lie. But then an old ache would rise within me, reminding me that the shadows still lingered, and that justice was not just for my past, but for every kid who ever sat alone, thinking nobody would believe them. I began by contacting a family law attorney, Ms. Guzman, recommended by another survivor I'd met at a campus event. Her office was a narrow suite above a Cuban bakery, filled with the smell of sugar and cinnamon. Her handshake was firm, her gaze unwavering. Over several sessions, I told her everything. The way Charles's voice turned to ice when we were alone. The nights I'd hidden in closets, Mom's distraction, the bruises I'd learned to blame on myself. She took relentless notes, pausing only to offer tissues or to ask if I needed to stop. I never wanted to stop. Each retelling was like lancing a wound, not pleasant, but necessary. With every session, I felt some piece of my old shame slough away. Our first big hurdle was evidence. In the years since Charles left, time had done its best to cover our tracks. I still had that battered notebook from middle school, and Mom unearthed calendars and family photos. My cousin M wrote a formal statement describing the change she'd noticed in me whenever Charles was around. Former neighbors contributed recollections. A polite man, but something off in his attentiveness during block parties. The way I'd suddenly become sullen and reclusive. Abby, my old friend, remembered a sleepover I abruptly canceled, crying to my mom afterward. Even Mrs. Rowley, my fifth-grade teacher, recalled how my grades slipped that spring and how I flinched at sudden noises. Each piece wasn't much on its own, but Ms. Guzman said it formed a mosaic of consistency that couldn't be ignored. The legal process moved slowly. After submitting the initial police report and my supporting materials, we entered what the system called the investigative phase. That meant months of waiting, sporadic interviews, and endless requests for clarification from detective teams. I spent days replaying every memory, scouring messages, reconstructing timelines. Sometimes I felt like a detective in my own life. Sometimes the inertia made me want to scream. At family gatherings, relatives watched me with cautious, sidelong glances, as if I'd suddenly become radioactive. News travels quickly in small suburban circles, and suddenly, old wounds and resentments trickled out of the woodwork. Some cousins called to say they were proud of me, but others asked why I couldn't just let it go. The old sense of invisibility threatened to return, but now I clung to the certainty that the silence had to end here, with me. Midway through the investigation, Charles somehow heard about the case. At first, he tried to call me. Blocked numbers, weird voicemails full of false apologies, and veiled threats. I saved everything and forwarded it to Ms. Guzman. He contacted Mom, too, at her workplace. She called me in tears, voice trembling with old guilt. But I reminded her this was not our fault. For every chilling reminder of his control, there were 2 new reminders of my resilience. The detective who took my report seriously, the friend who checked on me after tough interviews, even the therapist who taught me how to rest without shame. As we moved closer to the possibility of charges, I was called in for a series of interviews with the DA's office, a sterile, windowless room where I felt both 15 and 23, all my selves overlapping at once. They listened to my story, noted the supporting accounts, and explained the difficulties of prosecuting a historical abuse case. Statutes of limitations, witness credibility, the risk of re-traumatizing victims during cross-examination, all of it piled up like hurdles before a finish line. Still, I pressed on. Each time I told my truth, it grew sturdier. Each time I faced skepticism from an official or pain from a family member, I chose to stay the course. Then came the decision to pursue an indictment. I remember the day my phone buzzed during class, my heart hammering as I ducked out to answer. The DA's assistant calmly informed me that there would be a grand jury hearing. My vision swam. I wanted to cry, to faint, to run, but I just listened, silent and steady, and started making plans to come home. Coming back to Sacramento after so many years was surreal. The city seemed smaller, the streets eerily unchanged. I spent the night at M's place, sitting up together, eating ice cream and whispering old memories and fresh hopes. The morning of the grand jury, I dressed in quiet clothes, black slacks, a pale blue blouse. I tried to see myself as strong, capable, unshakable. The courthouse was cold and echoing, security guards' radios crackling in the hallway. I told my story to a room full of strangers, hands shaking, but voice steady, describing every night, every bruise, every reason I'd survived. I described how Charles had fractured not just my bones, but my sense of self-worth, how my mother's denial had cost me years of silence, and how the child inside me wanted closure, not vengeance. When I finished, I realized I couldn't remember most of the questions the jury had asked, only that when I left, I felt lighter, somehow, like I'd dropped a stone I'd been carrying for years. Waiting for their decision was a new kind of agony, but for once, I refused to hide. I walked along the river downtown, letting the wind tangle my hair, reminding myself that even if the outcome wasn't perfect, I'd finally honored my own truth. A few weeks later, we got word. Charles would be indicted. I was both terrified and relieved, overwhelmed by the realization that this journey was nowhere near over. There would be trial prep, press coverage, and testimony. There would be those who wanted to silence me, and some who finally opened their eyes to the darkness that had lived for so long inside our picture-perfect family. The pretrial months dragged into what felt like eternity. I worked with Ms. Guzman and a district attorney named Mr. Lloyd, who specialized in crimes against children. We reconstructed every detail: dates, names, patterns of behavior, my quietly coded diary entries. They explained how defense attorneys might try to pick my account apart, paw through inconsistencies, or dredge up the tiniest contradiction. I braced for humiliation and skepticism, for the possibility that Charles would twist the story so much that truth itself would feel foreign. One evening, after a particularly grueling interview with the DA's team, I sat in M's kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "It's not fair," I confessed, voice brittle. "It shouldn't be this hard to hold someone accountable." She squeezed my hand. "It's not fair, but you're doing what most people can't, facing it when it's easier to forget. That's strong, Sara." Those words became my armor. Whenever doubts gnawed at me, did I exaggerate? Was it really that bad? I looked at the stack of evidence, at Mom's haunted but determined eyes, and remembered, this was real. My story was not just pain, but evidence of survival. Friends from college called, texting encouragement, while old neighbors avoided eye contact at the grocery store. Some relatives sent messages full of support. Others stayed silent or openly scorned what they called my vindictiveness. Beneath all the noise, I clung to a new sense of self, one molded not by secrecy and shame, but by a blossoming hope that I could change the script for myself and others. Finally, the trial date was set. The courthouse loomed under a washed-out spring sky when I arrived on the first morning. As I walked through its glass doors, I felt both exposed and invincible, the ghosts of my childhood swirling around me. I glanced at the rows of reporters clustered near the steps, at the cold eyes of Charles across the room, and knew there was no going back. Testifying was more exhausting than I could have prepared for. On the stand, time seemed to slow. Each question from the prosecution, and later, the cross-examination drew memories out into the open. Each scar and fracture re-exposed to strangers hungry for certainty. I was forced to relive it again, not only for myself, but for the record, for the justice the system demanded. Some days, I thought I would break. I would leave the court, face streaked with tears, trembling with rage and exhaustion. But then there were moments of grace, when the judge recognized the pain behind my voice, or when a juror nodded, quietly validating what I'd always known. Mom took the stand and, in a wavering voice, described what she'd missed and how sorry she was. M testified too, and her calm honesty seemed to hush even Charles's attorney. The defense tried to pathologize my memory, to blame family stress, to paint Charles as a misunderstood man, but the evidence held. The jury listened, Every sleepless night, every anxious breath I'd ever taken, seemed to surface in those silent courtroom hours. When the verdict came, my heart pounded so fiercely I thought I might faint. The jury filed in, faces unreadable. The foreman stood and read the finding. Guilty. The word echoed around the room like a bell. I felt numb at first, then a great rushing flood of emotion. Joy, grief, release, vindication. It wasn't just about punishing Charles. It was about truth, about warning anyone who believed monsters must always win. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed and microphones angled for a statement. I managed a few shaky sentences about hope and healing, and why silence, in families like ours, was no longer acceptable. I could see Mom sobbing quietly beside me, and Em smiling, brighter than she had in years. Even in victory, wounds remained. The fallout was ugly. Some family members cut ties entirely, others circled back, quietly expressing regret that they hadn't believed me sooner. The relief was real, but so was the loneliness that followed. Healing is a winding path, full of both sunshine and shadow. I spent the months after the trial shuttling between therapy, advocacy meetings, and long, healing walks around my old neighborhood. I spoke at survivorship panels, sharing my story not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that the cycle could be broken. Sometimes, I still woke up in a panic, heart thrumming with old terror. But now, I knew it would pass. I was, at last, more than what had been done to me. The pursuit of justice taught me that closure isn't clean. It's messy, sprawling, sometimes bitter, sometimes sweet. It took everything I had to confront the past honestly, and everything I have now to build a future from that honesty. But I did it. I faced him. I stood for my truth. I reclaimed the voice I nearly lost. There is, I think, a kind of peace in choosing to fight for light, even when shadows have been home for too long. The story isn't over, not for me or for my family, but justice, however imperfect, finally knocked at the door of that old blue house on Maple Avenue. And this time, we let it in, bringing the monster into the light. The day of the trial began with a chill that went bone deep. Sacramento spring had always promised blooming cherry trees and new beginnings. But for me, the courthouse loomed as something older and more unsettled. I remember waking before dawn, stomach twisted into knots, replaying every moment that had brought me here. For years, my nightmares had always ended with his shadow swallowing the room. I never dreamed I'd stand on a witness stand, facing Charles, while a judge, jury, and rows of strangers waited for me to speak. The morning was a blur of routine. Suit pressed the night before, my favorite blue blouse tucked in, Cousin Em squeezing my hand so tightly I thought my pulse might stop altogether. Mom sat in the living room, clutching her coffee mug, lips pressed into a thin line. She tried to smile, but it flickered and died in the gray light. We didn't talk about what was coming. There were no pep talks, just a quiet acknowledgement that everything could change today, for better or for worse. As we pulled into the courthouse parking lot, my hands trembled so badly I almost spilled my water. The building was colder than I remembered from earlier hearings. Security check, elevators, the faint shuffling of lawyers in dark suits. I saw Charles in the hallway, surrounded by his defense team, their whispers like the hum of flies. He looked older, somehow smaller, but when our eyes met, his glare was all ice and defiance. For a split second, I was the child again, afraid, silent, wishing I could disappear. But then, Em squeezed my shoulder, and I remembered why I was here. I had come to reclaim my story, to drag the truth out from behind the curtains and let it finally breathe. No more shadows, I waited in a holding room for what seemed like hours, lawyers filtering in and out, reviewing my statement. My palms sweated through 3 tissues. My mouth was so dry I could barely swallow. Finally, it was time. The bailiff called my name, and I walked into the courtroom, eyes fixed on the stand, so I wouldn't have to see Charles right away. I'd practiced my testimony 100 times with Miss Guzman and Mr. Lloyd, but nothing prepares you to lay your trauma bare in a room full of strangers. My voice shook on the first question, but steadied as I named him and myself and the years he'd stolen from me. The prosecutor's questions were designed to make the story clear and unflinching. How did he act around you? When did it start? What did you feel? I answered as best I could, sometimes closing my eyes to keep the memories from overwhelming me. The defense tried to unravel me. They pointed to the years I hadn't spoken out, the lack of physical evidence, the way I'd sometimes described events differently in old journals. Charles's attorney implied that maybe I was confused, that maybe family stress or adolescent confusion had led me to blend stories, fabricate things I didn't understand. It felt like being skinned alive. Every answer was a battle to hold on to the reality of my own history, to not let myself shrink beneath the pressure of skepticism. Throughout it all, Charles sat stone-faced, only occasionally glancing my way. There was neither remorse nor shame in his face, only the cold calculation of someone who'd built a life on secrets. I realized, mid-cross-examination, that I pitied him. Whatever myth he'd sold himself about being misunderstood, about family loyalty, was collapsing under the weight of truth. He would finally have to face the damage he caused. Mom testified next, voice choked and shaking. She recounted the nights she worked late, the guilt she carried for missing signs, the hollow laughter that echoed in our happy home. I watched her crumble on the stand, tearful and raw, and I felt the sting of old anger replaced by something softer, understanding, maybe, or forgiveness. Too, described what she'd witnessed over the years, my shifting behavior, the sadness that lingered after family parties. The summer I stopped coming to sleepovers entirely. Each piece stitched together an undeniable portrait of what had happened behind our closed doors. The days of the trial blurred. Testimony, cross-examination, moments in the witness waiting room where I alternated between numbness and waves of nausea. Every day I walked past Charles, I grew a little taller inside. I saw the courthouse staff begin to smile kindly when they passed me in the halls, the young female bailiff quietly offering me chocolate on especially hard afternoons. I watched my mother for signs of collapse, half expecting she'd shatter and run. But instead, she surprised me. She kept coming back, chin set, eyes clearer with each passing day. Maybe she was starting to believe in the possibility of a future untethered from shame. When the closing arguments began, I felt spent, like someone who had run a marathon with a piano on their back. The prosecution delivered a simple summary, a call for truth, an insistence that justice did not expire when the wounds went unsaid for years. The defense sputtered, tried to poke holes about memory, motives, time frames. I watched the jury, searching their faces for hints. Sympathy, disbelief, fatigue, maybe hope. Deliberation took a full day. I passed the hours, staring out the window at the courthouse garden, feeling my body vibrate with old fear and new resolution. Brought me sandwiches I couldn't eat. Mom read magazines without turning the pages. I kept thinking of all the girls and women, children, really, who would never speak, who might not even survive to stand in a room like this. When the verdict came, the entire courtroom seemed to breathe in. Guilty. The word sounded strange in the space between my ears. A thunderclap and a balm all at once. I'd prepared for every possible outcome. But hearing the judge's gavel strike, seeing Charles finally realize the walls were closing in, felt unreal. At first I cried. Then I laughed. Then I just sat, dizzy with exhaustion and relief. The aftermath was just as complicated. News spread quickly. There were phone calls from distant relatives, texts from people I barely knew saying they admired my bravery. And then, inevitably, some messages dripping with resentment or denial. Some branches of the family cut ties completely, insisting I had destroyed Charles's life for my own gain. Others showed up at our doorstep with casseroles and tentative hugs, apologizing for not asking more questions, not noticing more. Sacramento's suburban shell cracked a little that week. For once, my pain was public, and the silence was broken. Charles was sentenced to serve time behind bars. I didn't attend the sentencing. I'd decided that moment in the courtroom had been enough. The judge remarked on the courage it took for me and for my family to step into the light. Maybe he was right. Maybe survival is a kind of courage, even if it doesn't feel that way most days. For months after, I alternated between lightness and a bone-deep ache. Trauma doesn't end just because the monster goes to prison. There were nights I woke from nightmares, convinced that the verdict had been a dream, or that the anger and silence would return if I let my guard down. Therapy helped, as did late-night talks with Em and my mom. We made new rituals, Sunday brunches, movie nights, walks by the river. We let ourselves grieve, then laugh, then remember that we still had each other. Healing was not a straight line. The greatest relief was the knowledge that I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. The person I became in that courtroom wasn't the frightened child from Maple Avenue. She was an adult who chose truth over shadows. Sometimes I'd visit the old neighborhood and see our blue house, sunlight gleaming off the porch swing. It looked smaller, less daunting, just a house at last. I would stand a little taller on the sidewalk, breathing in the scent of daffodils, and remind myself I was not defined by the secrets I had carried, but by the light I had finally chosen to let in. That trial marked a turning point, not just for me, but for my mother, for Em, and for the silent ones whose dreams were haunted by their own monsters. The day I brought Charles into the light, I realized that our stories aren't only about survival or suffering, but about justice, hope, and the refusal to let darkness win. Reclaiming my true self. If you'd met me during the months just after Charles's sentencing, you'd probably have mistaken me for another skinny 20-something finding her footing in the world. A woman, pacing city sidewalks with headphones, a faded backpack, and coffee in hand. But under that ordinary surface, every day spilled over with the quiet tumult of trying to piece myself back together. For the first time in years, the shadows in my mind weren't just places to hide. They were spaces where new things might grow. I remember the strange silence of waking up the first morning after the trial. A silence that wasn't punctured by racing thoughts about old fears or strategizing how to make myself invisible. I opened the shades in my tiny apartment, sunlight flooding the room, and let myself savor its warmth. For years, light had felt dangerous, like something exposing. Now, I tried to see it as an invitation. What would it be like, I wondered, to live fully in the daylight? But healing, the real kind, not the TV movie montage kind, was slow and uneven. Some mornings I felt buoyant, capable of anything. I'd lace up my sneakers and run the trails near my new neighborhood, feeling the beat of my heart as a promise. I am alive. I am here. Other mornings, dread would drag me down. I'd wake from dreams where Charles's shape still lurked in corners, or where my mother's voice crackled with disappointment, and the old shame or fear would return. I learned these waves were normal. My therapist, Dr. Anna, with her gentle Puerto Rican lilt, reminded me that trauma carves deep canyons and growth happens in unpredictable places. For a while, I was obsessed with milestones. I celebrated the first time I made a dentist appointment without panicking. The first time I let myself laugh in public without feeling like an imposter. The first time I invited new friends over and didn't wilt under their gaze. Each small act felt revolutionary, a tiny rebellion against everything Charles had tried to take from me. My journal filled with lists, not just the old coded secrets, but affirmations. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose next. Rebuilding my relationship with Mom was harder and gentler than either of us expected. The trial had cracked both of us open. For weeks afterward, our conversations were tentative, filled with apologies that didn't always land right, and soft laughter that reminded me of how it felt to be safe. We started a new ritual, Sunday dinner, just the two of us, sometimes joined by M, where we told stories from the past and imagined a different future. No topic was off limits, but we gave each other permission to pause when pain flooded the room. These dinners became lifelines, proof that broken bonds can be reforged slowly, with patience and choice. One afternoon, as fall turned the city maple leaves to gold, Mom gave me a weathered photo album, old pictures from my childhood, many of which I hadn't looked at in years. We sat at her kitchen table, poring over images. Me dressed as a bumblebee for Halloween, bike rides by the lake, birthdays with lopsided cakes and candles. I braced myself for the sting of lost innocence, but something else happened. I stopped seeing only the undertow of dread, or the false perfection we used to perform. There were real smiles in those photos, real joy, even if it was sometimes fleeting. I realized it was possible to remember the good without erasing the bad, possible to tell a braver, more honest story about my childhood. Reclaiming my life meant making new choices, sometimes bold, sometimes mundane. I changed my major from business to social work after attending a survivors advocacy panel and realizing how many stories were never told, how many voices still went unheard. The process scared me, but it felt right, like stepping into the world not only as someone who survived, but as someone who could help others survive, too. Therapy became my scaffolding. Dr. Anna pushed me gently to practice self-compassion, to see myself as more than just a bundle of wounds. I started yoga, grateful for the gentle way it tuned me back into my body, teaching me that strength could mean holding a pose even as your limbs tremble. I learned how to set boundaries and protect my peace, skills I'd never known I was allowed to exercise. The hardest part was facing forgiveness, not just forgiving Mom, but contemplating forgiveness for myself. For years, I'd blamed myself for everything, from not speaking up sooner, to letting things happen, to failing to protect the child I had been. In support groups, other survivors told similar stories, a chorus of misplaced guilt and anger. One night, after hearing a woman describe her own journey of blame and release, I wrote myself a letter. In it, I promised to treat the younger Sara with the kindness I would offer a scared friend. I tucked the letter beneath my pillow, and for the first time, I dreamed not of escape, but of peace. Rejoining the world wasn't a single moment, but a series of small, intentional acts. I reached out to old friends I'd lost touch with, Not to explain, just to rebuild, brick by brick. Some friendships had withered in the long silence, but others surprised me by blooming again. Abby, who'd always suspected there was more to my story, became a regular companion. We took long walks in the park, sipping iced coffee, sometimes talking about everything but the past. I became involved with a local support network for survivors, volunteering at their crisis line, and eventually facilitating peer groups. Standing at the front of those rooms, heart pounding, I would see my younger self in every nervous newcomer. I wanted them to feel less alone, to know there is life after trauma, messy, imperfect, but real. Telling my story and listening to theirs let me redefine myself, not as a victim or a product of someone else's violence, but as a person with agency, choices, and hope. Coping still has its rituals. There are days when my mind races and old fears knock at the door. On those days, I have strategies now. I light the lavender candle on my dresser, play the playlist I made with M, even the corny songs from childhood, and let myself rest. Self-care, for me, isn't bubble baths or shopping, though sometimes those help. It's letting myself rest without guilt, allowing gentle days, not always striving for productivity or stoic endurance. Sometimes I write letters, journal entries, even short stories about fierce, triumphant girls. Other times I take long, rambling phone calls with Mom, just listening to her talk about her students or favorite books, letting the normalcy pour back into our bond. Holidays are the hardest reminders of what was lost and what survived. Thanksgiving and Christmas bring memories sharp as peppermint. Some relatives still refuse to look me in the eye or skipped invitations, believing the old narratives over the new truth. But our table, though smaller, is stronger now. There's honesty between us, even when it hurts. Sometimes I feel the ache of those familial absences, but more often I feel gratitude for M, for my mother, and for the self who made it to the other side. There is laughter, sometimes tears, but always this undercurrent. Survival means you get to write your own traditions. I experienced a kind of rebirth in public spaces too. I started going to art museums, just to wander. I traveled for the first time by myself. A weekend on the coast, falling asleep to the sound of waves and letting the salt air heal some part of me. For years, I'd felt hemmed in, afraid of who might be lurking just beyond the corner, always scanning for exits. Now, I could be in a crowd and feel safe, not invincible, but present. I learned how to be curious again, to try new things, pottery classes, hiking, rooftop poetry readings, even embarrassing dance nights with friends where I let myself exist, unashamed. One day, walking past my old elementary school, I paused at the playground fences. The swings still creaked in the California sun. For a moment, I saw myself, smaller, brighter, laughing, without fear. I whispered a promise to that girl. I'll take care of you now. You survived. You're allowed to be happy. The child in me needed that assurance. She needed to be seen by someone strong enough to face the truth and still choose hope. Faith, both in myself and in the world, took longer to reclaim. I'd abandoned belief in anything larger than my pain for a long time, but through therapy, volunteer work, and friendship, I began to trust not some grand cosmic justice, but the quiet, everyday acts of kindness from others and myself. Some days, I found faith in small things. A sunrise over the city skyline, the first sip of strong coffee, a neighbor's shy smile. Other days, faith meant simply believing that healing, though not linear, was always possible. There were setbacks, in nightmares that sometimes spiraled, or in waves of shame that reared up unexpectedly. When those came, I reminded myself, relapsing into fear does not mean I'm broken or back at the start. It means I am human, and that healing is a spiral, not a straight line. Every time I climbed out, it was a little faster, a little easier. Progress, I realized, was not about erasing scars, but about learning to live tenderly with them. In the years since the trial, I began speaking at conferences and university panels, sometimes traveling across the country to share my journey. My story was never meant to be a spectacle. I told it because I wanted to show other survivors that the world could be different, that their truths deserved air and sunlight, too. Public speaking terrified me at first, but each time someone approached afterward and whispered, I thought I was the only one, I knew it mattered. My voice, once silenced and trembling, became a tool, not just for myself, but for the community of women, men, and children, forced into silence by fear or shame. I wrote letters to legislators, campaigned for education on abuse prevention, and sat in on meetings with school counselors to advocate for better protections. If I could help one person out of the shadows, it was enough. The world is slow to change, but I believe in the cracks where light leaks through. In every email from a fellow survivor, every tearful thank you, I glimpsed a future where fewer children had to bear what I'd borne, and where those who did could find their way out sooner, safer. Over time, I met someone new, a gentle soul who saw me not as a project, but as an equal. Early in our relationship, I was honest about the jagged chapters of my past. He listened without judgment, letting silence and soft encouragement fill all the spaces where I'd once hidden. Our relationship moved slowly, not a fairy tale, but something real, hard-won, and loving. For the first time, I understood what it meant to be wanted for who I am now, not who I had to become to survive. And yet, reclaiming my true self is not a finish line, but a practice, a choice I make every single day. There are moments I falter. I'll see a headline about a family secret, or overhear someone defend a good man too fervently, and rage will spark, or sorrow will settle like a stone in my belly. But now I let those feelings ebb and flow rather than drowning in them. I remind myself that speaking out was never just about vengeance or retribution. It was about becoming whole, about refusing to remain defined by someone else's darkness. Mom and I have continued to rebuild, tentatively but steadily. Sometimes we fall into old ruts, or my patience thins, or her defensiveness flares. But each time we begin again. She thanks me, often with tears, for giving both of us a second chance. I thank her for choosing to see me, finally, and for walking into the unknown with me instead of shutting the door. M remains my anchor, her encouragement grounding me whenever I doubt. Little by little, I've learned to love myself, not in grand, cinematic waves, but in the gentle, everyday acts. Forgiving myself for simply surviving, for wanting joy, for trusting. Again, there's pride in that. My greatest act of resistance is to live fully, boldly, in spite of everything that tried to pull me under. Looking back, it seems both impossible and inevitable. From the girl who scribbled secrets in spiral-bound notebooks to the woman testifying in a packed courtroom, my journey has been marked by both terror and tenacity. I reclaimed my narrative piece by piece, learning that truth-telling, painful as it is, can be the most radical declaration of self-love. My story isn't over, but it is wholly mine now. Every step forward is a vow. I will not return to silence. I will be who I am, no longer hidden, but alive and shining.